everybody, welcome back for part 3, a quick part 3 update of the Airfix 72 scale Vulcan build. In the last part I managed to get the internal structure of the lower wings done, so the bomb bay, the nose gear bay, and I've built up the main gear bays as well and the cross members for the bomb bay. But I didn't go ahead in part 2 and paint the top coats onto those parts. And that was because it was too hot in the shed when I came to do that painting a couple of days ago for part 2. So I'm making an early start this morning. It's a little bit cooler at the minute, so I should be able to get the top coats on without any fear of the paint finish graining, which is the reason why I didn't do them the other day when it was just far too warm. When I say warm, I'm talking about low 30 degrees in the north of England, which is pretty warm, but I know that those of you living in places like Australia and southern and western USA will laugh at 30 degrees, but for us it's warm, and I certainly didn't want to risk getting a poor paint finish on these parts after I'd spent so much time preparing and priming them. So let's get over and get this painting done. Okay, so let's get a base coat on first for these white areas, and for that I'm using this LP27. It's a Tamiya lacquer German grey, very dark grey. I don't want to use black particularly. I think this should provide enough of a contrast, so I'm using that as a second primer on these parts. So I've loaded the airbrush up. This is my Harder & Steenbeck Infinity. It has a 0.4mm nozzle and needle in there. I've got the compressor set to about 15 psi, and I'm using a relatively low pressure still because there's still some overhangs and various bits of detail which can cause the paint to swirl around in these areas. And you may have come across before when you've been painting that you get the grainy finish that I've been trying to avoid. And sometimes that's not just caused by the atmospheric heat, it's sometimes caused by the paint swirling around in all this detail. And it dries as it swirls around in the atmosphere, and obviously hits the model fairly dry, so it creates that grainy effect. There are a few things you can do to avoid that problem. The first, as we've said, is to make sure that it's not too warm so that these paints dry too quickly. The second is to turn the pressure down on the compressor. So I've got around about 12 to 15 psi on mine for this. So that means the paint doesn't swirl as much as it comes out of the airbrush. The third thing is to make sure that the paint's thinned properly. This is thinned at least 60% with thinners. And the fourth thing is with these lacquer paints is I use the retarder variety of thinners. So there are 4 things there that go together to help prevent that graininess and get a nice smooth finish on these parts. So I'm going to see if I can get this on. It's still a bit high at 15. So I've turned this down to 10 psi now. And because we've left the roof off here, we can get into all this topside detail before flipping over and painting from the underside. So we get full coverage doing it like that. Actually, I don't want the overspray on the outside at this stage. So I've just masked off around the nose gear bay, and the only reason for that is because I've not primed the underside of the model just yet. And if I were to get this lacquer paint onto that surface and then put the primer on, and because the primer that I'm using, Tamiya's primer, is a little bit hotter I think than the lacquer paints, it can just burn through it a little bit and give us a bit of a texture. So I just want a nice clean surface to be applying the primer to, so we don't run the risk of having any overspray here reacting with the primer when we come to prime the underside. So I can go in now from the underside and get into all the nooks and crannies from below. Okay, so those are the bomb bay and nose gear bay in its pre-coat of the German grey. It's come out nice and smooth, got into all these little recesses where the boxes are on the forward bulkhead. So I'll leave that to dry for a few hours, although this lacquer paint does dry very quickly. I'm going to leave it for a few hours before I put the before I start to add the white. I've got all the other parts to do as well, so I'll get those sprayed in the primer now. With these Bombay cross members, I just want to make sure that the insides are painted, because through these holes you'll be able to see the inside on some of them anyway. Some of them are solid, like that one, so that doesn't matter so much, but with these I want to make sure that we've got blackness underneath these beams. Okay, that's the first stage. So all the parts that I'm going to be painting white in the base coat, the German grey. We'll get a really nice finish on this lacquer paint. That's all ready now. I'll let that dry for a few hours and I'll come back and we'll do the white. Okay, time for a top coat now, and I'm using Tamier's Lacquer LP35. This is the Insignia white. It's just slightly duller than the flat white from the same range, and I just prefer it. It just gives a slightly more scale effect. And again, I've got this really thin. Okay, so let's give this white a try. Start off with the Bombay beams, and what I'm trying to do here is just to get some shading effect. So I'm hitting the corners of all these parts. And then just blend the part in like that. So it's a very delicate effect. Just get a slight shadow down at the bottom where it's going to be sitting down in the Bombay. So what I'm doing here is just applying the white in patches onto the larger open areas of the part, and not so much in the detail areas. And that just gives the starts to build up an impression of some shadow in here. Just makes the paint job a little bit more interesting. Then once that's done all over the part, I'll just go over it again with a fairly open spray. So bring the nozzle back and just blend it all in with a wider application of the paint. And don't put so much on that you start to lose the effect. On the camera that might just look white, but to the eye there's still some shading showing through underneath. So that's how I want it at this stage. So we'll do that with all the parts. I've just put the roof of the wheel bay in there, so it might just be possible to see the sort of shading effect that we've got down at the bottom, but overall there's a nice coverage of the white on those parts without it being too stark, and we've got the effect of the shadows as well alongside the detail there. I'll eventually give this a gloss coat and a very light wash. I don't want to throw a wash all over this, just in one or two areas, just to highlight these details in these gear bays. Maybe a little bit of detail painting here and there, but not too much. I'm not going to go overboard with that. That's all good. I'm going to leave that to dry now, and tomorrow I'll probably come back and give that an overall coat of varnish, and maybe do a little bit of that detail work on those parts. Just as a final thing to do, I've just inserted each of the Bombay cross members into place and just airbrushed around the edges, and that's just so that the intensity of the paint on this part, i.e. the Bombay wall, and the cross member is the same. I don't want one part to be greyer than the other. It wants to be looking as though it's all been painted at the same time. And when you paint parts separately like this, it's difficult sometimes to get them to look as though they're one. So that's just a little tip. Just put the parts in dry and just give them a dusting over with the white, and the intensity of the colour will just equalise where the parts join up. So we'll let all of those parts dry, and then we'll come back, varnish them, and we'll do a little bit more detail work with them. Right, so I've managed to do a little bit more work on these undercarriage bays. So I've just gone in with a very light wash just around this detail here, and a little bit around the boxes, but not too much. But basically where there's the pipe work along the side of the bay, I've used some MIG neutral wash, which is a grey colour really, so it's a good match for white paint surfaces. And then after that I've just gone in with a pure white dry brushing just to pick out the detail again here along the sides. But that's all I'm going to do with those. There's a bit of interest in there without going overboard. I think the dry brushing is the most effective way of bringing the detail out. Just a very rough brush and a quick dry brush pops the detail out nicely. So I'm going to leave that as it is. It's actually, the camera doesn't bring out the full extent of the shading on that. It is quite a bit stronger to the eye, but it's still not overdone. And that neutral wash, because it's a grey colour, just stains the paintwork a little bit and just adds to the overall impression of it being a grimy undercarriage bay. I do remember the undercarriage bays were a lot dirtier than the bomb bays. The bomb bays were pretty clean in my experience, but when you think about it, there wasn't a lot going on for most of the time in the bomb bay, whereas the wheel bays carried lots of moving parts which had grease on them and oil, which did get into the white paint and stain it. So the undercarriage bays on the Vulcan was quite a dirty place to be, whereas the bomb bay was fine. We could have our sandwiches up there. So this second bay has had a very light pin wash just around these cables. So I'll just go in with the cotton bud and just clean up the excess. Just get a clean one dipped in a tiny little bit of thinners or white spirit. These MIG washes are spirit based, so they will come off with some white spirit in this case. Just add a little bit more where I've taken a little bit too much off. Let that dry completely. I know that some people, I've seen them put a wash on and wipe it off straight away, and for me that really doesn't achieve anything. All I seem to do is pull the wash out completely, so I leave it to dry for a little while before going in and rubbing it off. So that last application is dry now, and I just want to rub some of the excess away and just blend it in with the rest of the surface. And I'll come in with a dry brush now that that's cleaned up. Just to remove any hard edge stains with this, you can go back in and very gently just dust on a little bit more of the base colour. Removes any hard stained edges and gives us that sort of result. So I'm happy with that. I'll do that with all the other parts and get them all ready. Then we can put them together and they'll be ready to go into the aeroplane. So when these wheelbays are installed, you can see there's not going to be much visible when we've got the legs in. But I'm happy with that. It's nice and weathered, not too bright and stark, and shows the Airfix detail off quite nicely. Okay, so that's all the bays done now. So I've gone in and just done a little bit more detail work. So I've just highlighted a couple of these boxes, or the top surfaces of these boxes, in some pure white, so you can really get a sense of depth when you do that. I've also highlighted these cleats here and the pipe work along the top. You can see I've managed to get the shadow effect underneath all these parts, so I'm pretty happy with that. It's come out nice. And when we come to fit those into the lower wing, that's the sort of effect we get. These wheelbays are nearly scale depth, I believe. The previous Airfix kit had very shallow wheelbays, but these are far more to scale. So I think it's just advisable to get a bit of relief painting in there. So they've come out just as I wanted them, really. Not too bright and white, but showing enough white highlighting to just pop the Airfix detail out. In the nose bay, again, I've just used a little bit of white here and there just to really highlight some of these parts. The cables at the back on this electrical box I've done in black, and there's also a bottle of some sort in here. I can't remember what that was. It could have been a fire extinguisher bottle. There were lots of fire extinguishers on the Vulcan for the engine fire extinguishers, and there were several in the bomb bay, but I seem to remember at least one in the nose gear bay, so that may be it. So anyway, just for a bit of variety, I've painted that in black. And with the roofing, again, quite a lot of nice detail in there. It's come out well. Okay, in terms of the bomb bay, I've not done too much with these cross members, and all I've done with the bomb bay bulkheads is to give them a dry brush with some pure white. You can see the detail again on the Airfix moulding. I haven't done very much at all with these cross braces. Just a little bit of a wash in the recess detail, just to bring that out a little bit. But otherwise they're just white with a bit of pre-shade on the lower side. It's pretty difficult to see, it's fairly subtle hopefully. But it'll just help to add some depth to the bomb bay when the roof goes in. So that's 3 of the cross members. When they're fitted, I might just go in with a little bit of white milliput just to close these seams up a little bit. It's not absolutely desperate that I do that, but just a quick wipe with some milliput and then just wash it away with water would just improve that a little bit. So I'll fit all these parts next time in part 4, where I just want to check the fit of the bomb bay roof, which is part of the upper wing halves. So that should be interesting to see how they fit together. But that's a good start with the painting. I'm happy with how they've come out, and hopefully we'll get them fitted without any incident next time. So I hope that if you've got the kit, you've got it onto the bench and are building it. It's been a lovely kit so far. I've not run into any major problems with it, and hopefully neither of you if you're building it yourself. But we'll be back to do that work next time in part 4, probably towards the end of the week, and I hope you'll join me again for that one. So bye for now, everybody. Take care.